And state visas, authorities also told airlines, go ahead, board travelers who were previously caught in this ban. But the Trump administration's vow to appeal could set up a second straight weekend of real uncertainty at airports across the nation.
We have a team of reporters and legal experts standing by to break down what this ruling means and what comes next. Let's start in Washington with CNN's Ryan Nobles. He's there with reaction, and the reaction from the White House was swift, Ryan.
Yeah, no doubt about that, Victor. And you can be sure that this just begins what is going to be a lengthy and possibly bitter legal battle over the future of this executive order from the Trump administration. And it is something, as you said, Victor, that the White House has vowed to fight right up until the very end. But make no mistake, this ruling has a direct and immediate impact, effectively halting Trump's executive order that prevented travel from those 7 Muslim-majority countries, in the Customs and Border Patrol telling airports around the country that it's back to business as usual as they begin the process of reissuing these visas. Now, this all stems from this emergency temporary restraining order that was put in place nationwide by a judge in Washington state, which effectively ended this Trump executive order, at least for the time being. Now, this could lead to another round of confusion at airports all around the country as airlines and customs officials attempt to try and figure out exactly how to implement this judge's ruling. Now, the Attorney General in Washington state who argued this case, Ben Ferguson, said that it's not his fault that this could lead to another round of confusion, but instead it is the fault of the White House. Take a listen.
The question went to, hey, because this happened at 4 o'clock, would there be some confusion? I'll tell you where there's been confusion. The president's executive order. That's what caused confusion. I'm sorry, there's no other way to put it. It's Keystone Cops. It really is. And that's not just me speaking. That's Republican members of Congress, right? That's what's caused the confusion. And so, no, I don't worry about the confusion. There's nothing confusing about the judge order. And the federal government will be expected to abide by it, and they will.
Meanwhile, the White House not backing down in any way, shape, or form. Take a look at this statement from White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer from late last night. At the earliest possible time, the Department of Justice intends to file an emergency stay of this order and defend the executive order of the president, which we believe is lawful and appropriate. The president's role is intended to protect the homeland, and he has the constitutional authority and responsibility to protect the American people. Interestingly enough, when this statement first came out, it included the word outrageous to describe the judge's order. A second statement was later put out, and that word was removed. So at this point, Victor and Christy, we're still waiting on the Department of Justice's official response to this decision in Washington. That could come at any time this morning. Victor?
All right, Ryan Nobles for us in Washington. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to take you now to CNN's Rachel Crane, who's at JFK Airport. Last weekend we were sitting here, Rachel, and there was all kinds of confusion at airports. What's it like there this morning?
Well, Christy, there is still an incredible amount of uncertainty here at JFK, how this new ruling will impact travelers. Now, CBP officials held a conference call last night at around 9 p.m. with all of the major airlines saying that business would go back to usual prior to the travel ban. This is according to an airline executive. Now, following that call, American Airlines taking down their travel alert on their website. Also, Qatar Airlines putting out a statement saying, as directed by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, nationals of the 7 affected countries listed below and all refugees seeking admission presenting a valid, unexpired U.S. or lawful permanent resident card will be permitted to travel to the U.S. and will be processed accordingly upon arrival. Now, Christy, advocacy groups, though, are proceeding with caution. Some groups are encouraging people to take advantage of this moment with all this uncertainty. However, other advocacy groups not wanting to get people's hopes up and are just waiting to see how this all plays out. Now, the State Department is working with the Department of Homeland Security, working to determine the effect of the stay. But as you pointed out, last weekend we saw a huge grassroots protest here at JFK demanding the release of the detainees that were held just following this executive order. And you know, Christy and Victor, we will see how the day unfolds here at JFK with all of this confusion and uncertainty.
All righty, Rachel Crane, thank you so much.
All right, so let's bring in a CNN legal analyst and criminal defense attorney, Danny Cevallos, joining us on the phone. And here with us in studio, immigration attorney Jessica Stern. Good morning to both of you. And Jessica, I want to start with you. Now that this judge, Judge Robart, has placed this temporary restraining order on this executive order, would you advise people in these 7 countries now to get on to planes now that they had these visas that were valid, they're being validated again, to come here to the U.S., or is the legal situation too volatile and you suggest they wait?
I absolutely would advise that they get on the plane and come into the U.S., Victor, because the court has said that there is a likelihood of success on this lawsuit that has been filed by the state of Washington and by Minnesota. And so the likelihood of this reverting back to the ban being in place anytime soon seems to be low. Yes, the White House will be appealing the decision, but ultimately the fact that this temporary restraining order was issued in the first place is a strong indication of where this is going to go and where it's headed.
Okay, Danny, let me come to you. This restraining order applies nationwide. Now, there have been other findings over the past week in relation to the president's executive order that were limited in scope to the district in which the judge presides. But Judge Robart explained this to the rest of the country. Explain why.
It's a fascinating issue. The judge actually, in probably the only real legal citation that had any teeth, cited to a very similar case arising out of Texas that involved the prior administration. But the important part of it is that case stands for the proposition, at least to this judge, out of the Fifth Circuit, and this would be a case out of Washington that we're talking about today, that immigration law should be enforced vigorously and evenly throughout the entire country. And based on that, the judge struck down this policy not just in his jurisdiction, the district in which he sits in Washington, but nationwide. And what's fascinating is that, in theory, the president could choose which court he decides he wants to follow. He could choose to follow the one court that sort of validates his policy, or he can choose to follow the court in Washington. And if he decides to claim that the court in Washington, he doesn't have to follow that court, then we have a bit of a constitutional crisis on our hands.
So this calls for immediate relief here, Jessica. Let me come back to you. For the people who want to come into the U.S., who were attempting to come in last week right after this was enacted, how quickly can these visas be reinstated? We know that tens of thousands were revoked during the week since the executive order. How quickly can these visas be reinstated?
There's been conflicting numbers, too, as well. So we heard maybe 40,000 or somewhere between that and 100,000. So it's the government. They are going to need to act swiftly in order to process these tens of thousands of visas. But we do know that in some of the orders that took place earlier this last week, that there was some delay in the Border Protection agencies complying with the orders. And so it seems as if they are addressing it and they are recognizing it, and hopefully it will be followed, but it will take some time for the visas to be reissued. However, the airlines are now supposed to be letting these folks on board with the visas.
Danny, there have been probably a half dozen defeats for the president's executive order. There was one just before this ruling came down from the judge there in Washington State. There was one victory there in Boston. But I wonder, as we await the response from the government, what do you expect will be the legal foundation, their argument as they appeal this restraining order?
Well, we saw from their briefs, and we even saw from Sean Spicer's statement out of the White House, that they believe the Immigration and Nationality Act gives the current administration the power to bar entry to those people that it deems dangerous. Now, of course, the state of Washington's position on that was that that particular section of the law is older than newer federal laws that say, no, not quite. In fact, you can't use these laws to discriminate against people. And then, of course, the state of Washington's position is that no matter what the federal laws say, it is unconstitutional. It's a violation of the Establishment Clause, the Equal Protection Clause, to discriminate against people based on race, national origin, religion, etc. So that the White House's position will be clear from both its statement and its briefs with a basis under which it will appeal. And frankly, I mean, given the state of the different circuits and the circuit splits, a reasonable judge on the Ninth Circuit might agree with the current administration. It's really reasonable minds may differ on this issue, as we can see, because they do.
Jessica, finally to you. For people who are attempting to come into the country, who found themselves in the situation last week where they were okay to come in potentially when they got on the plane on Friday morning afternoon Eastern time, but by the time they got here they were under this ban, what protections would they have potentially if that were to happen again if they try to get in, considering this restraining order?
Well, the change happened in mid-flight for so many of these people, and ultimately, if the airline lets them on the plane, they should be admitted into the United States. But it's hard to sue the government. Sovereign immunity is usually the main reason why people can't bring claims like this against the government. But, you know, we're seeing that people are not able to get to their jobs. Companies in Washington like Amazon and Expedia, they are missing out on their employees. Students of colleges are not getting to school on time. And so it could lead to issues that have further implications. But the advice is to not leave the country if you're currently here, just because we don't know how sensitive it could be or how quickly it could change. But if you are able to get on the plane and come into the United States, our advice is that you should.
All right, Jessica Stern, Danny Cevallos, thanks so much. We'll continue this conversation throughout the morning.
Thank you.
Well, the disappointment and the disgust over President Trump's travel ban that we've seen across the nation this week is being echoed this morning across the globe. Several protests overnight and expected to continue throughout the day. None more eye-catching, though, than the protests on the cover of this magazine. The story behind the controversial image, that's coming up. Welcome back. We're following breaking news this morning. The White House scrambling to challenge a federal judge in Seattle, a judge who blocked President Trump's immigration order.
Now, following the judge's order, airlines will begin reinstating visas that were canceled when the order took effect. That was last weekend. Now, refugees with valid visas, refugees and migrants, will be allowed to travel. Now, the White House is expected to call on the Department of Justice to file an emergency stay to that order.
This worldwide, too, a rebuke of President Trump's order. People are protesting in London right now. We have a crew that is headed there. We're going to bring you those images as soon as we get them. The demonstrations also expected today in Paris.
Now, this is the latest spate of protests across the globe with signs and chants of unity. Marchers there in Sydney, Australia, calling for immediate action over refugees. Dozens of students and activists in Indonesia, they demanded their government ban Trump. That adds to several protests along the east coast of the U.S. happening today. Here's the list. 1 o'clock, there will be marchers at the White House, also in Miami and Philadelphia. Then there's the LGBT solidarity rally over the ban. That's at 2 o'clock. Finally, a march at 6 tonight in West Palm Beach, Florida. And we should say that this list could grow. As we saw last week, there were spontaneous demonstrations at airports across the country. So expect this list to increase.
Joining me now to talk about it, Haroon Magal, Senior Fellow and Director of Development for the Center on Global Policy. Haroon, thank you so much for being here. First of all, I want to get your reaction to what's happened overnight.
It's good news, I think. A lot of folks, I think, across the United States and across the world are really worried about what this meant and whether or not America could stay America. And obviously, we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but it's nice to see that there's support for this in a lot of different quarters. The state of Washington appears to have standing. To have Amazon and big tech companies behind this also matters, and to be joined by Minnesota also matters. It means that this is not something that the American people, I think, as a majority want. And it's not something that our legal system is going to accept.
Do you expect that people who had their visas revoked are going to scramble to get on planes and get back to the U.S. at this point if they see this window of opportunity?
We have to remember that a lot of people who are affected by this, their entire lives are in the United States. They have families here, they have jobs here, they have their entire life is set up in this country, right? Tens of thousands of people have been affected by this, and it was implemented in such an incompetent, chaotic, and frankly heartless fashion that for those people, I would imagine they would want to be here as soon as possible because this is their home. Obviously, there are other people for whom the connection is not quite the same, and I would imagine they would probably be a little bit more circumspect. But I'm hopeful that this gives people whose lives were interrupted and in some cases damaged by the Trump administration a chance to basically try to resume things.
If they do come home, do you think they'll feel safe if they come back to the U.S.?
It is hard to. Well, let's be honest. The Trump campaign stressed this idea of a Muslim ban, of a wall, of mass deportations, almost from the very beginning. We can't forget how he started his campaign, how he referred to Mexicans, for example, and the kinds of things he said about certain kinds of Americans and certain kinds of human beings. And so there are people who say, well, this isn't a Muslim ban, but to me that's naive, if not offensive. We've all been paying attention for the last year and a half. We understand what it means when you have a candidate who's supported by white supremacists, one of whose senior advisors created a platform that basically makes National Socialism acceptable again in many parts of the United States. And so for him to then come out and say, well, no, it's not a Muslim ban, it's a travel ban, or it's simply a restriction, or it's a national security directive. Look, national security has been an excuse we've used in this country to harm people in this country and throughout the world for a very long time. So it's hard to feel safe, and this doesn't go away. And that's one of the most upsetting things about this, is that no one in the world is going to forget this.
There are a lot of people who support Donald Trump who say, look, I'm not a racist, I'm not a bigot, I just want to be safe. Is there an understanding of that thought in the Muslim community?
Absolutely. Who wants to see extremism and terrorism? But how do you keep the country safe by alienating the very countries you need to work with to fight terrorism? And if Donald Trump really cares about terrorism and people's safety, show me a single comment from him about the Quebec City terrorist attack, where the terrorist who attacked and killed 6 people worshiping claimed to be basically a supporter of the far right. Not a single comment. He doesn't care about terrorism. He doesn't care about violence against Muslims or people of color or minorities. He only cares about certain violence. That's the definition of supremacism and chauvinism. That is not what the United States is about.
There's a German magazine. We just showed the cover. I want to show the cover again. It's blasting President Trump's handle on America. And this is seen as quite controversial. What is your reaction to it when you first look at it?
I have to say I gasped. I was a little bit surprised by the violence of the image. I'm not a fan of that kind of image. I'm not a fan of that kind of dialogue. I'm not a fan of that kind of conversation. If the purpose was to draw our attention to what's happening, I mean, here we are discussing it, so I suppose in that sense it works. My problem with that kind of image is my problem with what we saw in the Trump campaign. Being offensive and abrasive certainly gets you retweets and attention and airtime, but it's not the foundation of a democratic conversation.
I wanted to just show some video here. I think we've got some video now of what's happening in London this hour. Some of the live pictures here of some of the protests that are going to be going on today against Donald Trump's executive order. When people of the Muslim faith and the Muslim community look at these kinds of crowds that are coming together to fight this, what is your feeling? What does that do for you?
For me, it's a powerful feeling. For me, obviously, there's an element in this where if you're a minority, you're a person of color, you're a certain faith, you feel threatened. The larger question here is what is happening to the United States and what is happening to the West. To me, it's not just that, hey, that's great, a lot of people in one of our closest allies came out in solidarity with Muslim communities. It's that a lot of people across the world are standing up in defense of certain core values. And across the United States, all these protests from different communities, people of all different kinds of walks of life, all different parts of the country, really represent this idea that the United States is not supposed to be a country where we use religion to define identity or nationality. And that's not a Muslim concern. That's a secular democratic concern. And that's something that we need to put front and center, that this is not just about my community or my rights. It's about everyone's rights.
Haroon Magal, so appreciate having you with us today. Thank you for sharing your voice and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Let's bring in Paris Dennard, CNN political commentator and Republican strategist. Paris, good morning to you.
Good morning.
So Judge Robart from the bench said this when issuing this temporary restraining order. Let's put it up on the screen for our viewers. The federal government was, quote, arguing that we have to protect the U.S. from individuals from these countries, and there is no support for that. I assume you disagree with there being no support for that. What's your case?
I think at the end of the day, we have to look at the intent behind what our president was doing. He's doing exactly what he said he was going to do on the campaign trail, and now as president, he's putting America first. And when you put America first, you have to remember, and everyone does, that there are people around the world, especially in these 7 countries, that want to do us harm. There are people around the globe whose sole intent, sole mission is to destroy not only our way of life, but other countries like in Israel. And so what the president is doing, understanding the weight of the world, understanding the threat terror levels across the country, especially on our homeland, is acting and putting in actionable things in this executive order to have a stay on travel and to do extreme vetting to make sure that those who are coming into this country are who they say they are, they're going to do what they say they're going to do, and ultimately keep the country safe. So the idea that this is somehow targeting Muslims or somehow racist or somehow doing anything other than keeping the country safe, I think is false.
Okay, so let's separate the intent from the execution, because much of what the argument from the attorneys general from the states of Washington and Minnesota, who brought this suit into the Ninth Circuit there, they say that what the problem here was the execution and the selection of these 7 countries. What we've also heard during this last week since this has been in place was that not one national of one of these 7 countries, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Sudan, Yemen, and we've got Libya there and Somalia as well, not one of them has committed a fatal attack here on U.S. soil. So the selection of these countries, what's the argument for the justification for those?
Well, I think that if the judge and if the state of Washington have a question about those 7 countries, they should ask the former administration. They didn't have a problem with it then because these 7 countries are not determined by the Trump administration. They used intelligence and they used the reporting and confirmations from the Obama administration. But those were limitations
on the visa waiver program, not a flat-out ban. But let me ask you, I'm getting...
But I'm just saying the seven countries were determined by the Obama administration and approved by the Congress. That's where it came from.
Yes.
So if you have a problem with that, they should go back and ask them why they chose them.
But that's for the limitations on the visa waiver program, not an outright ban. But Republican members of Congress have been critical of the execution of this executive order. How much support do you expect you'll find in Congress as the White House, as the Department of Justice executes this appeal to the judge?